So good morning. While we are waiting for more people to join us, a very good morning, evening and afternoon for wherever you are on the globe. My name is Philip Vergracht. I will facilitate this morning's meeting. The meeting will be recorded, so please be aware of that. I invite you to put your name, affiliation and location in the chat box so that we can see who else is on the call. So your name, your location and your affiliation, if you want.
It would be really helpful.
Stefan already did that. After the presentation or also during the presentation, you can put your questions to Lucie in the chat box. Because we cannot see you, and we will ask you to unmute yourself if you ask a question. Daniel Fischer, who is here with us, will support me with checking the questions and making sure that everything works okay. Before we start, I also want to announce the next two webinars on May 10, so that's already in 3 weeks from now. We will have Carl Tiedemann from Soil for Climate, and this webinar will be facilitated by Ashley Colby. And then on June 14, in 4 weeks after that, we will have a presentation of the SCORE Global Book Project, a book that will appear more or less today or this week. It's written by Valérie Bragia, Fabian Escher-Garret, Lei Zhang, and myself. And the title is Sustainable Lifestyles After COVID-19. And with that, I will not let you wait much longer. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Lucie Middlemiss from Leeds University. She is an associate professor in sustainability and co-director of the Sustainability Research Institute at the University of Leeds in the UK. She wrote the first textbook on sustainable consumption in Routledge 2018. And her research interests are in sustainable consumption, energy poverty, about which she will talk today, and participation in sustainable development. So this research brings together qualitative insights into the lived experience with critical policy analysis. She's motivating by connecting deep understandings of energy consumption in daily life with planning, measuring, monitoring, and decision-making by policymakers and practitioners. She has led a qualitative analysis of lived experience in 2019 and 2020 publications, resulting in insight into the importance of social relations in energy consumption. And she also has been part of a team who produced a white paper on energy poverty for the Netherlands in 2020. And with that, it's my great pleasure to give the floor to Lucie. She will talk for about 20-25 minutes, and afterwards we have a lot of time for questions and discussions.
That's great. Thank you, Philip, for the introduction. I'll just share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Excellent. I'll get going. So I'll be talking about those two things that Philip really introduced there, which is the lived experience research I've been doing probably since 2015, and then also the work on policy that I've been doing, which for me connects really strongly, and I think you'll see that as I go through. I thought it was sensible to start off with introducing the concept of energy poverty, because I realise this is quite a European concept in some ways, although it's also used in the development literature to talk about developing countries. For me, the definition from Sincock et al. In 2016 is the inability of households to access adequate energy services, including home heating, electrical appliance use and mobility. So households in relatively rich countries that can't access enough energy. In the UK, we use the term fuel poverty, which means pretty much the same thing, maybe without the mobility aspect. And as I've said, it's also a concept that's used in relation to the developing world. But today I'm talking about the global north. The academic community around the EU sees this as a multifaceted, dynamic and complex problem, moving beyond the original definition of this problem, which was low income, high bills, energy efficient households, which are still some of the key drivers of this. And then I would say that through the hard work of and activism of academics, policymakers, practitioners, this has become firmly ensconced on the EU agenda in the context of the energy transition, which is what they call low carbon transition in the EU policy circles. And then just with the final bullet here, I just wanted to point out that energy justice, energy insecurity, inequality, poverty, these are all links with both academic concepts and real world concepts that we're very much aware of. But I suppose we're taking the policy term to start with when we talk about energy poverty, a bit like we are when we say sustainable consumption. So today I want to talk about my work in two key areas. I started out with an interest in the lived experience of energy poverty, daily life of people experiencing this problem. This came really from an interest in people's experiences of resource scarcity in the global north. For me, this is important work both for the present day, so to understand how poor people are able to consume in contrast to richer people, but also for thinking about transitions to a low carbon society, for thinking about planning how we address this in the context of low carbon ambitions. So this lived experience research inspired a second area of interest, energy poverty policy, where I look critically at how policy conceptualizes this problem in contrast to the lived experience. Often there's a big gap. And I also, more recently, as Philip said, I've been helping to craft a more productive policy towards a just transition, and that's in the Netherlands. And I'll be talking a little bit more detail about that later on. Then I'll finish the talk by talking about my vision of what energy poverty is, and therefore what we need to, the sort of principles for how we need to address it. There's lots of references all the way through. If anybody wants any detail on anything I've written or wants to follow anything up, please ask either in the chat or by email afterwards. So the lived experience of energy poverty then. Most of my work here has been done in the UK, and it's about conducting long interviews with people about their day-to-day life and how the challenges they face in terms of accessing adequate energy services. The value of this really is a detailed exploration of the site in which this problem actually occurs. So the benefit of talking to people in their everyday lives is to understand how people are affected by policy of all sorts, actually, but also to show us where opportunities are for different kinds of action. I'm going to start off with an example. I'm going to talk through the life of Usha, who I interviewed in Bradford, which is in the north of England, near where I live in Yorkshire, in 2016. So Usha is 35. She lives with a daughter, aged 10, in a small privately rented house in Bradford, which is poorly insulated and maintained. She's disabled and her daughter helps care for her, as do her siblings and her mum, who sleep overnight at her house on a rotating basis, as well as paid carers who come in during the day. Usha and her daughter go to live with her mum during school holidays, and her daughter stays with her sister or her ex-husband when Usha's in hospital. Given this rather transient household, it's difficult to say who actually lives with her or where she actually lives. Usha has a chronic health condition similar to MS following a medical accident, and she has very limited mobility, chronic pain, incontinence and low energy levels, resulting in a heightened need for warmth, regular hot water and additional clothes washing. Before the accident, she was married, had her own home and worked as a lawyer. Because Usha is disabled, she has access to a car through a government scheme, which allows her to take her daughter to school. Usha depends extensively on help from others, so negotiated relationships with others, to access energy services. For instance, her prepaid meter needs topping up the local shop, which she can't easily access alone. She needs help to access the shower. She sometimes can't get out of bed to take her daughter to school in the morning and asks friends to help. Usha frequently borrows money from family for her energy bills, and a local energy advice service has helped her switch suppliers, but having a prepaid meter is a condition of her tenancy. As a disabled person, Usha's living in a time of uncertainty with her status and access to a car under threat as disability policy is reviewed in the UK. This amounts to an uncertain relationship with the state and causes intense worry about how she might cope without the extra income and the car. Usha was previously fiercely independent, but since the accident has had to rely on others, and she hates this. Her descent into poverty has been distressing with regards to her self-image as an independent and self-sufficient person. Her various identities as a mother, being from a Pakistani background, being disabled, also impact on her energy consumption and her social life. For instance, she wants to cook from fresh for her daughter. She feels it's part of being a Pakistani mother, but has to be mindful of the associated energy costs. She rarely goes to other people's houses because she needs extra warmth everywhere and is embarrassed to ask for blankets. You get the sense of the sort of life that Usha is living. In looking at this kind of data, so looking at multiple life stories in this way, we then start to identify and be able to characterize how people experiencing energy poverty understand the challenges that they face. And in the first piece of work I did on this with Ross Gillard, we identified 6 challenges as experienced by people living in energy poverty, fuel poverty for the UK. Households can be made more or less vulnerable to energy poverty in relation to these challenges. And as I said before this, energy poverty was usually characterised in quite economic and technical terms. I would say, I'm not going to go through these in detail now, that they kind of come out throughout the talk, but the key points I think from this initial work was to say that absolute poverty is in evidence in the UK, so that we have extreme cases where people are not heating and not eating. Usha wasn't one of them. She was able to access those basic services, but there are others that experience that. Vulnerability is complex, so people experience vulnerability due to a number of intersecting reasons, and that are listed on the screen now. These intersecting factors can compound vulnerability. So if someone's in a cold home, they're ill, they have poor network of social relations, they don't have access to transport, this can almost multiply people's experiences of vulnerability. And what we really felt at the end of this first piece of work was the need to open up more social explanations. And the elements I've highlighted in red here seem to be really worthy of further investigation, to offer more social explanations, but also because we didn't know what was going on in relation to people's social lives and how that impacted on the way that they could consume energy. So that was where a series of projects around energy, poverty and social relations came from, with a very long list of collaborators. And I'm not going to name them because it's such a long list, but they're a really great team, looking at secondary qualitative data to answer new questions about energy poverty. So looking at previously collected lived experience interviews to ask new questions here. So what do we mean by social relations? And there's a paper on this in Nature Energy that I've written with Tom Hargreaves, so you're welcome to go and follow that up. Here, I just want to briefly say that we mean, well, we know that energy is not consumed in as a solitary activity. Energy is consumed in families, by workplaces and so on. And as a result, those kinds of social structures impact on how people consume. And here we've identified 3 that are particularly important in relation to households. So relationships of the household with family and friends, both inside the household and outside. Relationships with agencies and communities, maybe an energy advice service, the local school, these kinds of things. And relationships of identity. So relationships that are to do with how we identify as a Pakistani British mother in Usha's case. So we argue that understanding people's relationships offers new ways of thinking about how to intervene from a policy perspective, but it also tells us a lot about how people consume energy, because much of this, as I say, is done socially. So if we return to Usha's example here and look at her social relations, and I've written a long list of things that kind of relate to her relationships here. But the ones I'll pick out are the ones in red. So for instance, her disability results in dependency on others to access energy and energy services. So that's particularly dependency on her family and friends. Then also for the agencies and community level, the fact that she has a prepay meter, which means she has to pay for energy in advance and is typically in the UK more expensive way of paying for energy. She's locked into that through her tenancy status. And then I've talked quite a bit about the fact she's Pakistani British, and as a result of being Pakistani British, she has different access to social support than other households would. In this case, she has her extended family looking after her quite intensively, and that's not always something that people can access. So then when we start to think about how a single white British man with no social support network might cope in these contexts, that they suddenly look quite a lot more vulnerable, particularly because men tend to be less well socially connected than women. So we having done that first piece of work, we decided to go. We wanted to look at how people engage in the energy market from this demographic. So people who can't access enough energy, how do they engage in the energy market? And just to give you a little bit of background on the UK energy market, because I realised that all the energy markets are rather different. It was founded relatively early for the EU, well, very early for the EU in the late 90s, liberalised in the early 2000s. And we have, according to the regulator Ofgem, we have about 40% participation on a yearly basis. What that means is in any year, 40% of people will check other rates, or switch supplier. So be engaged in some way with that market. But the energy poor are much less likely to participate. So it's a concern that despite that what that means effectively is that energy poor households are going to be on worse tariffs than average. Through our work, we've been finding that that's one of the reasons for this is that the market is understood relationally by the energy poor as opposed to rationally. They're not acting like rational actors. Instead they're understanding their role in the market as relational. And I'm just going to give you a quick example from one respondent for that. So for instance, we find that sometimes trust and loyalty is placed in energy companies, sometimes not, of course, but the quality of the relationship with the energy company affects whether someone wants to participate in the market or not, switch away or stick with the supplier. And this extract from an interview with Prunella is about how someone in the energy company helped her to apply for a grant and told her which documents to complete. And as a result, she felt she had very good feelings towards that energy company. So she says, yeah, he was really nice and he's left me his number. And he said, if I need anything, any more help, then he said, I'd just give them a ring and he'll get back to me. He explained everything. Like you get some and they don't, they can be a bit standoffish, but he wasn't. He was really nice. So this sort of warm response to the customer service operative from the company results in Prunella not being as interested in switching supplier. And I think that's an aspect of relational values shaping effectively the way that this person is engaging in what is assumed to be a rational market. Of course, it isn't acting as a rational market. I put the picture in to show that this can go completely in the opposite way. So the example is a woman's trying to explain herself and the man on the other end of the phone is going, pardon, what did you say? Like implying that she can't be understood. And that kind of ruder response can also result in people switching. So you can see why that is driven by relationships as opposed to rationality. It's another form of rationality effectively. Okay, I'm going to leave the lived experience stuff for now. I'll mention it again right at the end, but to move on to talk about policy. And really, this is the transition that I took in working on this topic. I went from thinking about lived experience research to looking at policy and thinking, wow, they are describing a world that is so different to the one I'm seeing on the ground. And that really got me motivated to think about policy in a bit more detail. And I started by looking at English policy on what they call fuel poverty as opposed to energy poverty, partly because I live here, but also because the UK is seen very widely as the first mover on this topic. So Brenda Boardman, who is an activist and academic working on these issues, coined the term. And then also kind of set up, made sure that in the UK there was all sorts of action on this, has been since the early 1990s. And then EU has kind of picked it up in recent years, as I'll say. I'll give you more details on that in a minute. And member states have started to implement it too. In the UK, in England, I should say, there's a tendency to pick one measure to define the problem. And I've just listed the 3 measures that have been used over the years. This is really associated with a culture of government in the UK, where we like to narrow things down to the one indicator. Not particularly helpful in this topic area, I would say. But of course, also the indicator, or the set of indicators that we choose, it shapes the way that the problem is defined and the way and the indicators that get picked. And as a result, it has a big impact on what is and what is not on the table in terms of potential solutions. And I would say that I've written about low income, high cost, the middle measure, in quite a lot of detail back in 2017. but also low income, low energy efficiency, which I think is an improvement. But both of those really failed to question the role of energy prices. So they don't engage with the idea that the energy market is any kind of problem. And I think given the fact that we know that it's failing the poorest people, this is a real sort of miss in terms of UK policy, English policy. But in different nations, there are different conceptions of this, and an international comparison, which is what the EU is kind of founded on, is really valuable because it reminds us that the way that we conceive of it is not necessarily a given. I'll just give you some examples there. So there's a common conception of energy poverty in richer EU nations, Germany, I think Sweden, definitely the Netherlands, and to some extent Denmark, although I'll talk about them again in a minute, that this is just a symptom of poverty and can be dealt with through poverty policy. And I have quite warm feelings towards that way of thinking, but at the same time, I see there is also a value of thinking about this separately, particularly when we think about low carbon transition. In France, the energy poverty is seen as a complex issue, taking multiple forms which have overlapping but not mutually exclusive populations. It's quite a systemic view, which I like a lot, and I will articulate that in a bit more detail later on. And then in Denmark, the way of understanding this problem is not in terms of energy poverty, but in terms of mold in the household, which of course has the same root. Cold creates mold, but at the same time, it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. And all of, effectively all of these kinds of perspectives are being brought together under the banner of the EU. But within the EU, there has been a real sea change in the way that this agenda is treated. And I would say that there's a really strong role there has been a really strong role by activist academics. So Harriet Thompson and Stefan Buzerovsky are listed here. They're both based in the UK. They've been really instrumental in getting various EU schemes started, including EPOV and Engager. And I would encourage you to Google those and find out what they're all about. Which have really kind of raised the agenda on this topic across the EU. And then as a result, there are now policies that speak explicitly to this agenda. So the energy transition is what the EU calls a transition to a low carbon future. That's principally about environment, but it also engages with energy poverty, as does the more recent policy on renovation wave, which is about energy efficiency in the EU. And so the next bullets, which are really detailed, I'm not going to go into them in detail, but I would say that there are specific requirements for member states to define criteria, measure and create policy on energy poverty. So it's like the agenda is pushing down into the member states now. And that's at the point at which I'm going to tell you a bit more about the Netherlands. So I wanted to give you a bit of detail on our work here, which really what it has been is a group of academics and researchers intervening in policy in the Netherlands, inspired by lived experience research, but also by seeing the action that was going on in the Netherlands and wanting to help create a national policy in this space. So until now, it's been a problem that was largely ignored at national level. I've already referenced that. However, there is a strong interest and focus on the energy transition in the Netherlands. And I would say that two political movements are impacting on this in particular. One of them is that local and regional stakeholders are acting on this. So they see it as a really useful issue. Governance in the Netherlands is quite strongly decentralized. So local and regional stakeholders are responsible for all these agendas: climate, poverty, health. And as a result, they see this as an opportunity to develop action that effectively kills several birds with one stone. They also explicitly link energy poverty and climate goals in local plans. And there's been some really inspiring work been done on that in more local parts of the Netherlands. Secondly, the EU push on energy transition also requires this consideration of energy poverty. So there's a sort of movement from below and above towards the national government of the Netherlands to do something about this. And the fact that energy poverty is on the carbon reduction agenda, that there are targets associated with the carbon reduction agenda, it means it's really important actually to have some form of energy poverty understanding at that level, to know what the impacts of, let's say, the heat transition to heating by electric as opposed to by gas. What impact will that have on households that can't afford to invest in new technology and so on? So just to outline what we've done. So we, as I say, we staged an intervention through this event in 2019 that was sponsored by Engager, this network of researchers on energy poverty. We got to be front page news in the Dutch broadsheet, the Trouw. And then we wrote a white paper out of that, co-authored with Engager members, including myself. And then as a result, in 2021, there is now an emerging policy. So there's an interest in from government in this. And we also think that the election that's just happened, we still think that there's still an interest in this. So there's still a sort of interest in forming some policy because they can see it's coming down from the EU as well. Our key points here is the need for national policy to ensure that the budget exists and to ensure that inequalities are not created by some regions and municipalities being active and others not. And the TNO, the research agency, are leading on this and drafting this new policy. So what do we recommend in this white paper? Our recommendations are about linking these two things, environment and poverty, effectively, through a multi-indicator framework, which is needed to capture the interplay between policy areas. And the image here shows the sort of range of issues people face in their homes. I realise the font's really small, but for instance, cold rooms, physical and mental health problems, high energy expenses, debt, there's a real range of different things. And the idea is that we can use multiple indicators to measure this, as well as monitoring in the lived experience as a way of identifying unintended consequences, as well as the broader impacts on the energy poor. The second thing we recommend is to directly address energy poverty in national policy, given that carbon reduction targets and policy is set at national level. Having that will help to ensure that there's a conversation across those domains, as I suggested earlier. And then thirdly, to integrate energy poverty into other policies, which is a classic recommendation, but also a very challenging one to avoid policy silos. Having said that, it's happening at local level in the Netherlands, and perhaps there's some room for national government to learn from that more local or regional systemic approach. What can we learn from this in the Netherlands and beyond? I'd say that in the EU, the transition policy is a real opportunity to raise this agenda in nations that aren't currently interested in it. And why is it an opportunity? Because there's a kind of requirement for countries to report on this, so to incorporate energy poverty into energy transition measuring, monitoring and action. And then I would also say that when we see it systemically, you start to see what the value is, I suppose, in addressing one aspect or addressing this topic, which kind of overlaps between health, financial and sustainability, environmental sustainability. And so all those things leading together to working on all those things at once can be seen to be a real win-win for governments, I think. So very briefly, the sort of vision that I think I've articulated from the academic and policy and practitioner work in this area is that as a socially systemic understanding has three key facets. One is that energy poverty has to be understood in the context of the social, physical and technological conditions. It's not simply a matter of lowering bills or even just insulating. Usha would not be okay if you insulated her house. She'd be better, but she'd still need higher level of temperature because of her illnesses. Secondly, people's experiences are affected by intersecting challenges according to the conditions that they live in. And I guess the diagram that I showed you before, the challenges will be different between different households and also caused by different intersections of policy according to the way that national and local policy works. And then third, not least in the context of low carbon transitions, the nature and progression of these challenges is going to change over time. So as we change policy for environmental reasons, this will sometimes have deep and detrimental effects on social life. And so we need a sort of politics of energy poverty that embraces this multidimensional experience and that reaches beyond that narrow focus on energy. And so, sorry, the pictures look a bit repetitive at this point, but I quite like these ones from our report that we did, our white paper we did. The principles that we've come up with to talk about how you can do this better. One of them is integrating policy across domains. and then building networks and partnerships, so including outside of government. So that's really attempting to break out of policy silos. And then the third and fourth are around the complexity and the dynamic nature of this problem. So measuring holistically and expecting the unexpected is kind of a way of seeing knock-on effects, seeing unintended consequences, so that you can do something about them. So just briefly to summarize in conclusion, the sorts of insights that I think I have from this work, well, the lived experience research is really interesting. I mean, it's effectively qualitative research, deep qualitative research on people's lives. And when we see the site in which a problem or a phenomenon happens in such a lot of detail, well, energy poverty, consumption, whatever it might be, we can really see how people are affected by a variety of different policies from different domains, as well as from the house that they live in, their family structure, and these kinds of things. And so it's a really useful site for me for monitoring problems like this, or monitoring the way that the policy is having effect. The social relations work, I would say that people's relationships are important both as a context for consumption of energy, but also as a specific means to access energy services. And those thinking about them in those terms, you start to think about different kind of policy that could emerge from that. Energy poverty is a rising political agenda in the EU that speaks really clearly to the subject of a just transition. And I think for me, it's a companion policy area to sustainable consumption, bringing underconsumption in everyday life into focus, and then allowing us to think about how these everyday lives can be more positively affected by environmental policy. And then finally, academic work on energy poverty offers ways into measuring this problem, revealing its workings through the lived experience and offering insights for policy and practice. So for instance, the insights that you do need to deal with really isolated households. Isolated households have not been thought of as vulnerable before, but when you do the social relations work, you realise that that's going to be a big problem if people can't share or find extra help from elsewhere. And again, very briefly, my future plans. I'm involved in a big Horizon 2020 project on energy poverty called Wellbased, which is about evaluating interventions in 6 EU cities on energy poverty and health. I've also got some funding with colleagues at Leeds to look at social relations in place-based low carbon renovation. So this is not necessarily for energy poor households. I feel like there's an opportunity for transatlantic collaboration and exchange of ideas, perhaps on this theme of energy poverty, or something that sounds more like something US colleagues could collaborate on. So maybe that's something for the Scaro book series. And then I have a couple of PhDs working on this area. So Ling Zhang is working on energy poverty in China, and Irene Gonzalez Pijuan is working on energy poverty in children in Spain, EU, and UK. And then I'm going to finish with my contact details, as well as a little plug for a couple of jobs going in Leeds. So please do have a look at those if you're interested in joining our fabulous team. Thank you very much, Philip.
Well, thank you very much, Lucie. This is so interesting and so, yeah, a little bit unfamiliar for me personally. So stand by me. We already have one question from Tom Abeles. I will read it, but maybe Tom, you want to unmute yourself, and maybe you can read it yourself if you are able to do that. If not, I will start to talk. This talk focuses on the developed countries, where many are aware of the issues, if not all having it high on their list. The real issue is in the developing countries, where infrastructure and flexibility are not present, and the ability to transition is not affordable. So please, Lucie.
Yeah, I guess I would say in developed countries, we might have low carbon transition on our agenda quite firmly. Not in all, of course. I mean, I think the US has been through an interesting few years under Trump. And of course, you know, these are the goals are there in a way. Whether we, you know, how and whether we reach those goals is another question. But I would argue that it's not at all the case that people are thinking about different kinds of consumer in relation to those goals. And so, I mean, one in the Netherlands is a really good example. The attitude has really been, you know, we don't have poverty here. We don't have real real challenges. And it's true, they don't have poverty in the way that we have in the UK, and neither in the Netherlands do they have poverty that they have in parts of other parts of the world. But at the same time, there are still people that are struggling. There are people who, like I said, in the UK, we certainly have absolute poverty. We have people who don't eat and don't heat at all in very cold climates. And so I think that connection between low carbon goals and poverty goals is not something that people are really hot on in richer countries, because we tend to just assume that everyone's okay and then carry on as if everyone's okay. I completely agree with you. There are all sorts of challenges all around the world, but this is the one that I've chosen to focus on because I think it's really important to make sure that those goals go hand in hand.
So, yeah, Tom, feel free to react if you want. I cannot unmute you, but you can write in the chat box or in the Q&A. So I have a question that for myself that is related to upgrading houses, insulating houses, replacing gas and oil with electric and so on. It's an issue that is played very much in the US at this moment with the new government, but also already locally for a longer time in the context of climate action plans and so on. So the upfront cost of these issues is very high, and people need subsidies, but even the residual payments is very high. So we basically face a challenge how to massively retrofit houses for people who individually has to take these decisions, have to pay money. And of course, poor people don't have this money at all. And then also I want to bring to your, as a question, the landlord-tenant issue, right? The tenants pay the energy bill, and the landlords are pressured to upgrade their houses, but don't have direct benefits from them.
Yeah, it's a split incentive is the way we call it, and it really is, isn't it? I mean, you do, actually there is no incentive as a landlord necessarily. However, it has been done differently in different places, and I would say, so I had a colleague from Denmark visiting for a few years back, and unfortunately we never wrote up the work. But she found that there was a moment in the 1980s when the UK policy became to sell off council housing, so to sell off social housing to private individuals, and so now we have a much smaller social housing stock than other European nations. It was under Margaret Thatcher. And at the same kind of time in Denmark, there was a change in legislation around investing in rented housing. So in Denmark, there's a law that says you've got to invest a certain percentage of the income that you make from renting out a home into the fabric of that home. And if you compare the UK and Denmark, Denmark has twice as efficient housing as the UK does, right? So what it shows is like those policy decisions over time have these huge effects. And I know now we just want to act now and we want to get on with it and we want to sort of retrofit in massive quality. But I would say then the only way of doing that, really the only way of doing that is to have zero cost options for quite a lot of households, really. Because if you think, I mean, in the UK, the average household income is about £35,000, which is roughly equivalent as the same in dollars and euros. It's not that much money, and it isn't really enough to be investing in the sorts of solutions we're talking about. So, air source heat pump, for instance, which is really kind of being talked about as one of the really great technologies, ways of electrifying heat. Costs about £15,000. So if you think about £35,000 and then £15,000, it's a really big proportion of your income to be paying towards that. Obviously, you can pay for it over time and all the rest of it. But I think there are plenty of people that earn underneath that average amount. And so we really can't do it without some form of investment, which has to be then, I think, through taxation. I think general taxation has to then invest in these kinds of renovation, which, I mean, it has so many positive consequences. It has climate consequences, it has health consequences. So living in the cold is really, really bad for your health, mental health and physical health. And then it also has positive social consequences in the sense that people have a bit more money that they can then choose to spend on better things than burning carbon and heating up their homes to an unsatisfactory level. Very often households experiencing this will use that extra cash to just be warmer, which is great. It really, I mean, it just means they'll have better health overall.
So thank you. I have follow-up questions, but I see that Jaco and then Rachel posed question. Jaco, do you want to post the question yourself? You have to unmute yourself. If not, I will read it. Thanks for interesting and insightful presentation, Lucie. Also for your view on the Netherlands. My question relates to the future justice going beyond the current energy poverty. So how to stimulate, guarantee that the cost of low carbon transition and the remaining energy costs are fairly divided on the different groups in society?
Thank you, Jaco. Yeah, great question. And I think that we can see lots of evidence of that not happening. So, for instance, the feed-in tariffs that many European countries had seem to favour relatively wealthy people who could afford to invest in and buying the technology, let's say solar panels, and then recouping the feed-in tariff from the generation of energy from those. And I think it's really common that it's another reason why we have to think about energy poverty in relation to energy consumption, because otherwise we end up effectively subsidizing relatively rich households to do a good thing, right? But also to then be making money out of something that somebody else didn't get a chance to make money out of. And I think general taxation for me is always the way. I just feel like if you some of my colleagues at Leeds did some work on this, John Barrett and Anne Owen, they talk about how if you fund energy poverty policy and principally in their case, low carbon policy through general taxation, it's much less regressive, because effectively you're taking the money off the people that can afford to spend the money. And in contrast to that, the most common way, I think, tends to be through energy bills, which is the most regressive way, right? Because it means that you maybe pay an extra amount of euros on every I don't know, a certain number of euro cents on every euro that you spend. But as a result, the poorer people who couldn't afford much in the first place are then further restricted in what they can consume. And that's a real problem.
Thank you, Lucie. So I need to apologize for the fact that attendees cannot see each other. They also have no access to unmute as a reaction to Tom. And people don't know how many people there are present. There are at this moment 29 participants. The maximum was 30. So we are very pleased with that, of course. And I apologize that in the future we will use a different format for these webinars that is more user and participant friendly. So I have a remark from Rachel. I cannot see the last name. Thanks very much, Lucie. I'm interested to know more about the lived experience research and how you engage people and communities in the research process. That's a very important question.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Really nice question. And I think it's a real challenge, actually, because, I mean, it's a really controversial thing to be talking about. Turning up to somebody's house and talking about their experience of poverty, effectively, is difficult. And I suppose I would say that we get a variety of responses. You can have people that are really don't want to tell you about what's going on in their lives. I've had interviews where I've thought at the end of it, that wasn't the whole story. I didn't get the whole story. There's also interviews where people really do want to tell you everything that's going on in their lives, because maybe I had one interview with somebody, particularly memorable one, where he just got a job after 2 or 3 years of unemployment and really tough life time for him, and he told me everything, because it was clearly like, I'm okay now, so I can speak these things. So I think, I mean, there's a sort of the challenges of talking about something really controversial, also the ethics of that. So asking somebody to unburden themselves for the sake of research does feel rather uncomfortable at times. Having said that, I can't tell Usha's story, and I can't make links between Usha and policy unless I know Usha's story. So that's kind of been quite important. Just one other thing to say is that one of the things we've been doing in the last few years, so the two projects with lots and lots of authors were secondary data projects. So we were looking at secondary qualitative data on this topic. And one of the reasons we did that was because we really thought we had a lot of data already, and the process of collecting data is potentially quite traumatic for both us and the people that are being interviewed. And so it seems like we really ought to make the most of that data in thinking about how in thinking about what we can get out of it. Quite often in qualitative work, you'll write up the paper and maybe you'll tell 3 stories from it, and there were another 20 that you didn't really tell. And so to make sure that we really make the most of that data, I think is really important. But there's also a bit of a movement in the UK at the moment to link lived experience of all sorts of social challenges. So lived experience of racism, lived experience of sexism into policy making. And for me, that's really inspiring and exciting, because actually then maybe it's not me doing the research that ends up talking to the policy maker. It's somebody that's had this happen to them that ends up talking to the policy maker. Having said that, that's a challenge, right? That's difficult to do. And so in some ways, the fact I'm the middle person is quite good, because at least it's some form of voice for people.
So I have another question. Thank you from Tom Abeles. I will read it. Many utilities at the local level take poverty and other limits in the US and parts of the regulatory requirements. This is particularly important in climate-stressed areas such as northern winters and southern summers. Issues around homelessness and related issues are also of concern for both the political and business sectors. Not perfect.
I'm assuming you're making a point.
Did you get the question?
I think so. I think the point is being made about business's role in this, or the business sector's role in this, and how business are also taking this seriously. And I would say,
the utilities,
yeah, and utilities. So I don't know exactly how it works in the US, but I think we also have similar initiatives going on here. So for instance, that if you have certain kinds of if you're disabled and you have particular needs for energy, that you're on the list, and if there's some kind of power cut that you are kind of looked after in that context, that somebody will come along with a generator to help you survive that. And so I think there are, and that's kind of business led change. But I would say that I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. There's also in the EU, in Europe, there's also a move towards this idea of a right to energy, in a similar way to a right to water, led actually also by Dutch scholars. There's some Dutch scholars that are really active on this. And I think there's an argument to be made that maybe this isn't the best kind of industry to be making a profit out of, given its associations with poverty, and I mean in this particular context from the consumption perspective. And I mean I kind of would feel quite warmly towards that, given that you can't actually live through a northern US winter presumably without some kind of heating. You would really not survive that. I think I don't know whether you can do passive house in the north of the US, because it's really, really cold. And I think also in the south of the US being so hot in the summer, those kinds of extreme climates, not relatively extreme climates, are something to think about when it comes to a right to energy, because people must be dying more in the hot summers and dying more in the cold winters, like they do in the UK as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I have now 2 questions, and also somebody was looking for your paper and he found it, but I want to say that there will be a record of this whole webinar, and in the record will be the links to the papers, if I understand it well. So Daniel, you're next. You can unmute and make yourself visible. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I cannot actually start my cam. I don't have the rights, but the permission. But anyway, thanks so much, Lucy, for this really interesting new perspective to me on energy as a key topic in sustainable consumption. I guess my question is a bit broader. I'm wondering what opportunities you see to expand this line of research. So is there anything you would say that broader research on sustainable consumption can learn from the research you did on energy poverty? Like, are there any impulses that from your work that you would like to see applied to other consumption fields, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, definitely. I mean, I came into this as a sustainable consumption scholar, really. That's kind of where I came to it. And I suppose my motivation for thinking about it is that my sort of fairly deep-seated belief that we've got this tendency to see consumers as a kind of homogenous unit, like people that buy stuff, when actually consumers are quite complex beings, and they also have resources or not. In this case, we're talking about people who don't have the resources to consume in the way that we, that leaves them to live a decent life. But then also, I mean, there are other aspects of the way that we consume that shape what we do. And I really think the social relations stuff we've done, and the paper that I wrote with Tom about this can apply in loads of different ways. I mean, why do we eat what we eat? We eat what we eat because of who we were brought up by, who cooked for us. And then maybe we deviate from that. So I have a big kind of, my students quite often go vegan or vegetarian when they get to university, having been perhaps meat eaters when they were at home. And so, there are moments in life when things change. And we know about this in the sustainable consumption literature as well. People have worked on those kind of life moments. But at the same time, that the social nature of consumption, I think, is really, really interesting to think about in other fields. In other consumption domains, I suppose. And then also not just with this resource poor group, but also with other categories. So the next project that I mentioned at the end of my talk that we're going to get started in May is looking at 3 different neighbourhoods in the UK and thinking about how they consume energy socially, how they renovate and how that's affected by their social relations, and including the aspects of energy renovation that we all kind of know about through the low carbon agenda. So I think there's huge amount of crossover. I suppose the main thing would be for me the social relations work, which is something that I've always worked on and has always fascinated me. But then also that idea of difference, so there are lots of consumers with very different backgrounds, histories. There might be Pakistani British, they might be disabled, there might be, and all those things are going to shape the way that they consume. And so we have to, well, I suppose the bigger message there is that we have to do sustainabilities or sustainable consumptions or environmentalisms rather than just one way of seeing the future. That for me is really important.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lucie. So I have 2 more questions at this moment. One is from Stefan Waloszkowski and the other from Catherine Mahoney. So from Stefan, a question for Lucie. Your stories mainly featured women who experienced energy poverty. Can you elaborate your thoughts on the gender dimension of energy poverty? Of course, yeah. Stephen is very interested in this topic as a researcher.
Yes. I mean, I'm glad you're interested in it. I think it's an area that really needs a bit more work, and there are people working on it, as I'm sure you know. But I think that so I mean, very often when we talk to people experiencing these problems, the gender dimension would be around the sort of the broader. I mean, women tend to be poorer than men on average. Women-led households tend to be poorer than households that have both men and a couple involved in them. So single-parent households are really important in the energy poverty world. Women live longer, so older women living alone are a real concern here. And I guess I mean the fact that women also do a lot of the care work associated with children is also a really big thing, and from the perspective of potentially being at home more does depend totally on the culture and the person, but being at home more in the daytime and therefore being more exposed to cold, particularly if the man in the household is going off to a warm workplace, then there are real challenges there. I should say cold or heat, because obviously in hot countries the heat is really important, but I think it's something that we need to think about more carefully. And I guess my engagement with this field has been about trying to understand these kinds of differences. So I have another project on the go, which is in review at the moment with my colleague Diana Ivanova, which is about disability and energy poverty. And we're finding that disability predicts a lower energy consumption even when you take out income. So disabled people are also poorer, but at the same time it has an even greater impact on their ability to consume energy across the board. Diana works with energy as a sort of almost like a metaphor for all the different forms of consumption that we engage in. So I kind of think gender is important, as are other kind of social kind of differences like that, like disability. Yeah.
Thank you. So from Catherine Mahoney, thanks for a great talk. I was just curious to get your perspective on the role of energy companies in installing energy efficiency measures, like the UK eco model, for instance. Do you think this is an approach which works, or should this role be taken up by alternative bodies?
Hi, Catherine. Nice to have you here. I would say I can't really comment on that in a very informed way, apart from perhaps to say that we have had examples of local authorities running these kinds of kind of big transformations in environmental energy efficiency. So the Kirklees example is a really interesting one. It's one in Yorkshire, so I like to use Yorkshire examples. Where a local authority decided it was just going to insulate all the households in the area. It was paid for by the private sector through one of the through the eco scheme, I think, but it was run by the local authority, and therefore the local authority just went street by street and put loft insulation and cavity wall insulation in all the houses that could have it effectively, and it made a massive difference to the levels of energy poverty in the area, as well as huge carbon benefits, right? I mean, that's the environmental payoff is absolutely huge, but also then local tradespeople were learning how to do this in a way that, so the money was going into the local economy. There was just loads and loads of obvious benefits. So I think that there is a potential for local authorities to be more engaged in this kind of thing, perhaps also because they know their people and they know their buildings in a way that the private sector won't so much, unless it's local private sector, of course. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe I have a last question, if there are no other questions at this point. My question is about the COVID dimension. So in COVID-19, more people stayed at home, obviously, and maybe after COVID, less people will go back to work. So do you have ideas, reflections on what the pandemic, how it affected this whole area of living and research?
There have been some there has been a bit of research on this, and I can't remember who's done it and and precisely the outcome, but I think the concern is really about households that can't afford to heat all day in cold climates, and then in the summer, if we get similar stay-at-home orders, households that can't afford to cool all day. But then, I mean, it's also tied in with digital inclusion and whether people have access to the internet, whether people have the devices that they can also pay to power in order to access the internet. And I guess, I mean, I think also with downturn of economies and lack of jobs, all these things are kind of tied in together with COVID. So it's quite difficult to see what the effects are. Having said that, I also think only certain kinds of jobs are going to be staying at home. So, I mean, my workplace, the university, is talking about a different kind of occupancy of offices in the future. But if you're in a factory and things just need making, you're going to have to go to that factory. Or if you're a builder, I mean, the builders in the UK worked through the whole thing. They haven't stopped. And I think those it does depend what kind of job you have as to whether you can do it at home. And then in the UK, we've seen a lot of differences. So I live really near Bradford, the city of Bradford, which has a big Pakistani population. And also they found that many of the inhabitants of Bradford counted as key workers, so they were working with food or transport, or so they were having to go out to work every day, and they've had real problems in lowering the COVID rate as a result. So I think, you know, we've got all sorts of things going on there that really ultimately probably is reinforcing inequality rather than alleviating it, I would say.
Thank you, Lucie. So The hour is up, and unless there are very pressing questions, I don't see them at this moment. I would like, first of all, to thank you very much, Lucie, for a very interesting presentation and also for sparking off a really great discussion. So thank you all the participants. And before I close, I would like to say again that this record has been recorded and will be accessible through the SCORE website. And the next two presentations, the next two webinars will be on May 10, Carl Tiedemann from Soil for Climate, and on June 14 from the SCORE Global Book Project Post-COVID, Sustainable Lifestyles Post-COVID. And with that, thank you everybody, and I will close this webinar. Have a good day and be well.
Thank you for having me. And do get in touch on that email address if you need to, or through Twitter.
Okay.